Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would like to continue and synthesize the discussion that we've been having for the past year and a half on the historical and logical analysis of the burning of the house of Syeda Fatima Zehra SWT. We're at a point, especially in 2022, where it is important to bring together the facts as well as the logical perspective that leads to these discussions. So in this particular discussion, I would like to bring together those different concepts and aspects of this very important historical aspect and an event that laid the foundation of the Islam in a way that deviated from the guidance of how it might have turned out if people had followed what was guided by the Prophet ﷺ. And the purpose of this is to share this holistic view that isn't shared in different discussions, whether in majalis or by the brother Muslims who don't either want to talk about this event because it is sensitive and it could cause division in the ummah. And then the second aspect that it is important about this event is they don't want to bring this up because it's hard to pinpoint the facts as they're widespread, as they're like very separated out intentionally, I might say, because the intent is to confuse the masses about this event. So that's the goal of this discussion, that I want to share what has happened. And in order to do this, this is not the first one, this is not the first episode or the podcast that we've been doing on this topic. There are 20 plus other discussions that have happened on this topic. The approach that we have taken, I want to synthesize the approach because it is important. This will give the context that you can take and use this to build your other logical analysis, read or hear other podcasts, or do your own research. But the approach is very structured. So first of all, we wanted to understand what is the background of the event in order to really understand, with the goal in mind that we want to really understand what happened after the death of the Prophet to Syeda Fatima Zehra. We wanted to understand what is the background. So what was the event? What did the daughter of the Prophet has to endure right after the death of the Prophet? And that had two parts. One was it involved self-study and discussions. The second one was related to this movie that came out at the end of 2021, The Lady of Heaven. Now, as I went into the discussions, and we were fortunate enough to do the research, we came across different perspectives on the movie itself, which was very interesting. So there was one perspective which was coming from the broader Muslims, and the second perspective which was coming from the Shia Muslims. And both of them were very different in nature. One group was saying, from a historical perspective, this event is based on weak narrations, and that is their argument, the broader Muslims. From the Shia Muslim perspective, no one argued that this event didn't happen. What they were more concerned about was how would this result in Shia Sunni unity or Muslim unity, or like cause fitna and other things. But no one said that this did not happen. We can argue whether their other arguments were right or wrong about the Muslim unity, but that is one fact. Then we went into historical research, and there are two dimensions of historical research as well. One dimension is very much focused on the broader Muslim stories that come from our brothers Muslims in like the 6 Sahih books of hadith, or in other famous books of hadith from our brother Muslims. And then the second set of narrations or historical research was based on the Shia sources, which, by the way, there were specific narrations from Shia sources, as well as the events mentioned in the books of the non-Shia sources corroborated the events that were outlined in the Shia books. So those were that was the third step, so historical research. But as you would imagine, history can be negated by a simple argument that I don't trust this, or this is weak, or this never happened, or what you're saying are lies. So in that situation, what should a person do? So that brings us to the fourth step, which is logical arguments. And that will be the focus of this podcast, to really understand the logical arguments. What were the facts? What were the two versions of the facts? Where does the complication come into these logical arguments? And then understanding, did the house burn? Which house was burned? Who burned the house? What happened with the compilation of narrations? Was confusion created? Who created confusion? Was it intentional? And then what were the circumstantial evidence? Which will then lead us to the fifth point that every single Muslim should consider. Should you support an alleged perpetrator, or should you support the oppressed? And how would you answer to the Prophet on the Day of Judgment? Now, when you bring all of these things and think about these questions, then you would have to think about, how do you bring together and marry historical discussions with logical arguments that will give, or that should give us, enough evidence to indict or at least raise doubt about certain personalities in the early days of Islam. Because once you have that logical evidence and you start building that contextual evidence, then the key is, let the mind think. You need to have a holistic view of what happened and why, and what is the impact of that. Because this is literally going to impact the way that we lead our lives, the way that we conduct our lives, the way that we support the oppressed, the way that we will be answerable on the Day of Judgment. Because the efforts are judged not on the actions themselves, but on the niyyah. And if our niyyah is to support the oppressed who laid the foundation of Islam, or if our niyyah is to support the oppressor, then the results will be very different and their judgment will be very different. So let's have that perspective in mind. It will be a key thing to consider on the Day of Judgment. So now, how do we evaluate the logical perspective? I've outlined this framework that we'll go through one by one, but at a very high level. I don't want to go into detail right now, but what we want to understand at the top is what transpired after the death of the Prophet. What are the two versions of the history, and where does the complication comes in? And if someone discredits history, how can we use logical arguments and circumstantial evidence to understand the situation that unfolded? So there are two parts to that. One is understanding the historical evaluation of the event, compilation of narrations, their weakness and manipulation. And number two is circumstantial evidence. Who benefited from the event, and so on. And this will lead to certain important questions that we should be thinking about. Questions that anyone should be thinking about. Whether we should support the perpetrator or whether we should support the daughter of the Prophet. So, for the first phase, before we go into the details, let's think about three things. What transpired, the facts, and questions related to her death, the death of Syeda Fatima Zehra. Let's talk about the two versions of the history. What does the Shia Muslim version and the version of Ahl Bayt al-Islam say about the historical events? And then talk about the broader Muslim version that focuses on ignoring the event as this is weak. And then think about the complication. One group says that there was a tragedy that happened, so you cannot give a blank check. On the other hand, there's a second group that denies anything happened. So how do you evaluate these two perspectives? So let's think about the facts. The fact is that Lady Fatima Zehra SWT passed away within 3 months of the death of his father. Some might say up to 6 months, but literally there is no version in Shia or broader Muslim texts that says she lived more than 6 months after the death of her father. The death of the father, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, happened according to Shias on the 28th of Safar. According to Sunnis, it happened on the 12th of Rabiul Awwal. So according to them, the birth date and the death date is the same, 12th Rabiul Awwal. According to Shias, the death took place on the 28th of Safar and the birth happened on the 17th of Rabiul Awwal. Just a side note, but those are the dates. Now, according to Shias, the death of Syeda Fatima Zehra either happened on the 13th of Jamadil Ula or 3rd Jamadil Sani. So almost 90 days after the death of the Prophet, 75 days after the death of the Prophet. On the Sunni side, there is no exact date. I did a lot of research to find out if there is an exact date. There is no exact date mentioned about the death of Syeda Fatima Zehra. The one narration I found was about 6 months. So then there are a few questions that come up within this duration between the death of the father and death of the daughter, Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Syeda Fatima Zehra. There is a period of 2.5 months to 3 months, or at max 6 months. So there are a few questions that one needs to ask. Why did Syeda Fatima Zehra die so quickly at the prime of her life? Did she just die because of the grief of her father? Or was she physically injured that resulted in her quick decline of health and then passed away? Was she actually martyred? Was something taken from her? Where is her grave? Who buried her? Where were the Muslims at the time of her death? So if you think about these things, in order to think about these questions, let's first lay down certain facts that are agreed upon between Shia Muslims and broader Muslims. So facts about the death of the Prophet and facts about the life of Syeda Fatima Zehra after the death of the Prophet. We'll come back to these questions, the questions that I raised in the previous slide. We're going to come back to these questions which are written on the right, but I want to highlight the facts. So first of all, Lady Fatima Zehra SWT was young and the only daughter alive when the Prophet passed away. That's a fact. How young she was? According to Shia Muslims, she was 18 years old. The Prophet died after 10 years of Hijrah. She was born after the Prophet became Prophet. So basically, she was born after he was 40 years of age, and after that he lived in like 10 years in Makkah and then 10 years in Medina. So she was around 18 when he passed away. According to Sunni Muslims, she was 28, 25. Regardless, she was young at the prime of her age. Secondly, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said unequivocally in all the books, in Bukhari, it says, whoever angers her angers me. A very blanket statement about the status of the Lady of Heaven. Third, she had the title Leader of the Women of the Heaven, or the Lady of Heaven. And fourth, only for Syeda Fatima Zehra, Prophet had said, Fatima is a part of me, and whoever hurts Fatima hurts me, and whoever hurts me hurts Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, no one else comes close to this merit of Syeda Fatima Zehra. So this is everything that the Prophet said about her daughter. Now let's talk about the life of Syeda Fatima Zehra from the historical books after the death of the Prophet, and the facts, nothing else. She died within a few months after the death of her father at her prime age, 19, 18, 19, and we just talked about the duration in which she died, 3 months or 6 months maximum. Her inheritance, fadak, was forcefully confiscated by Abu Bakr. This is mentioned in Bukhari. She gave a very fiery speech blasting the coup leaders. It's mentioned in Ibn Thafur, which is a famous book of broader Muslims. There was an altercation between Umar and Fatima Zehra at her door. It is mentioned in Tarikh Tabri, again a famous book of the Muslims. An attack on her home resulted in miscarriage of her son Mohsin. This is mentioned in Al-Sharastani, again a famous book of the broader Muslims. When I say broader Muslims, these are primarily Sunni Muslims, also known as Al-Sunnah wal Jama'at. They like to call themselves. She cried for most of the time after the death of her father, a very commonly accepted fact between the Shias and Sunnah. She expressed her displeasure with the Caliph and did not talk to him, again mentioned in multiple books of hadith. Is specifically instructed for Umar and Abu Bakr and others to not attend her janazah. This is mentioned in Al-Bukhari. Her janazah was attended by very few people and was buried in night. Ibn Sa'd, a famous historian and hadith collector of the Sunni Muslims, she was angry with Abu Bakr, again in Al-Bukhari. Her grave remains unknown till today. This is a commonly agreed upon fact. No one knows whether Shias or Sunnis, where is she buried. People say that she is buried in Jannatul Baqi, but that is not. If you ask someone, they will say no one knows where she is buried. Now, with these facts, let's go back to the questions. Why did Syeda Fatima Zehra die so quickly at the prime of her life? Did she just die because of the grief of her father and stopped eating while she knew that there were 4 small children dependent on her in her house? Or was she physically injured that resulted in a quick decline of her health and she passed away from that? And she was martyred because of that. Secondly, was this her first loss, or had she experienced loss of family before? Because first loss can be catastrophic. So yes, if this was the first loss, one could imagine that she was so traumatized that she couldn't bear it and she passed away crying. Number 3, was something taken from her that made her sad? Number 4, who was present at her janazah and who buried her? Why is her grave unknown? These are few questions that we need to think about, because if we think about these questions and we come to a conclusion that something happened to her, it needs further investigation, that's a good conclusion. I'm not saying we're going to reach the answer of what happened as right after this slide. I'm just going to, my only request, part of these questions, is to just think, was everything normal or did something happen which was not normal? Let's continue. So on the left side, we have the questions. The 3 questions, the 4 questions that we raised in the last slide are mentioned on the left. And on the right are the answers, the versions of the answers by Muslims, Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, who are the broader Muslims, or the Shias of Ahl Bayt al-Islam, who are the minority Muslims. So let's look one by one and think through these questions and the different perspectives that are brought by the different sects of Islam. First of all, Why did Syeda Fatima Zehra die so quickly at the prime of her age? Did she just die because of the grief of her father and stopped eating while she knew that there were 4 small children? Was she physically injured? Was this her first loss, or had she experienced loss of family before? So, first of all, according to broader Muslims, Prophet's death wasn't her first loss. She had lost her mother at a very young age, right before the migration to Makkah, from Makkah to Medina. The Prophet lost his wife, Hazrat Khadija, in Makkah after the boycott in Syeda Abi Talib. At that point, she was roughly 8 or 9 years old, so she had lost her mother. And not only her mother, she lost also her grandfather, who was the Abu Talib, the protector of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, within 3 days of each other. So she had experienced significant loss at a very tender age of 8. On the other hand, the Shia version is very much aligned with that Prophet's death wasn't her first loss. She had lost her mother at a much younger age. At that time, she did not have the responsibility of her own children. If she can handle the loss of her mother, she could have handled the loss of her father, especially when she knew better than anyone else. Kullu nafsin dha'iqatul maut. In Quran, Allah Ta'ala says, everyone will taste death. Syeda Fatima Zehra is the leader of heaven, leader of the women of Jannah, and Allah has outlined in Quran the qualities of leaders as ilm and jism when Talut was appointed as the king of Bani Israel. So logically, she had the highest wisdom and strength to not succumb to temporary grief. So that particular point proves that she had endured loss before, and she was well equipped to endure loss again, because she knew that everything that happens in this world is temporary in nature. Therefore, the logic that she died immediately because of crying fails over here. Now let's come to the next point. Why did then she die so quickly? Was there something that happened on her door? Was she injured? So let's think about this. Point number 2, according to the broader Muslims, they say, and their narrations that mention this, that there was an altercation between Umar and Syeda Fatima Zehra, but then they say she did not die because of the altercation. It was the grief that took her. And she stopped eating and drinking and kept crying, which led to her death. That's what they say. But there was altercation with Umar, and their narrations that, as I mentioned in the facts before, that she had a miscarriage as well from the Muslim brother books due to this altercation and the subsequent events. So that's one version, the Muslim version. Sunnah Muslim, or the broader Muslim version, the regular Muslim version. Now let's think through the Shia version, because we have to think about both the versions in order to do comparative study. Shia says there was an altercation between Umar and Syeda Fatima Zehra. It's mentioned in both Shia and Sunnah books. This was followed by her house being burned and the door being slammed on her, which crushed her ribs and caused the miscarriage of her unborn son and serious bleeding. These injuries were compounded by the grief of the departure of her father, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which led to her early death. Now there is a big difference over here. There is one component which is missed in the broader Muslim history. That is, that altercation was followed by the door being burned and being slammed on her, which crushed her limbs and caused the miscarriage and caused internal bleeding, which led her to her declining health, and compounded by the grief of what the Ummah had done after her father's death. to the leader of the ladies of the heaven resulted in her health declining and she passing away. Now let's look at the third point. Was something usurped from her that made her sad? On top of everything that we have just discussed, was something else that was done to her? So according to our Muslim brothers, the regular Muslims, fadak was taken from her according to the judgment of the Caliph, and that judgment was influenced by Umar, the second Caliph. In parallel, at the same time, her husband Ali was brought to the court because he did not give bay'ah to the Caliph. Now let's look at what the Shia Muslims think. Yes, they agree that her right of fadak was usurped. Fadak was taken on the premise that prophets don't leave inheritance, while Quran explicitly says that Sulaiman and Zakaria were the inheritors of their prophet fathers. Hazrat Dawood was the father of Hazrat Sulaiman. And then Imam Ali alayhi salam's right was usurped, that was given to him on the day of Ghadir. This usurpation of her rights amplified her grief, and these atrocities, number 2 and 3, because of these she kept crying day and night till she died. So she was injured, she was sad because of her father's death and what Ummah had done after that, and then she was further saddened by her husband's right being taken away in a coup, and she was further saddened by her property that was given to her as inheritance by her father being taken away. So it's like compounding of atrocities on this lady of heaven, on top of being injured. So then the next question is, if this happened, this was the cause of the death, the early death, which everyone agrees, we also need to understand one more fact. Who was present at her janazah and who buried her? Why is her grave unknown? So according to the Muslims, broader Muslims, the grave is unknown, no comments on the janazah and funeral, and no one talks about it. There's no information that you will get over there, except for, yes, even they say that there are narrations in the Muslim books, broader Muslim books, that after she was buried, Umar came back and said, we are going to dig her body up and do the namaz salat al-janazah because we love her so much, which proves the point that she was buried without these people knowing. On the other hand, the Shia version is very detailed on to what happened about that. And the detail can only come from people who were part of the janazah, not from the people who had no idea what happened for the janazah. So according to Shia Muslims, only 8 people were present at her janazah. She explicitly prohibited the Caliph and prominent Sahaba who have done injustice to come to her janazah. Ali alayhi salam buried her at night. That's why there is dispute about her grave. No one knows about her grave because no one attended her janazah and funeral. So up to this point, my dear brothers and sisters, the thing that we have gathered so far is there are 2 versions of history: a regular Muslim version and a Shia Muslim version. The Shia Muslim version paints a picture where she is a strong lady. She had endured losses before. She had survived those losses before. She had more responsibilities to even be worried about these worldly losses. But she was oppressed. Her door was burned. It was slammed on her. She had a miscarriage, internal bleeding, compounded with taking away her right of fadak, taking away the right of her husband, of the wizarat, the right that was given by the Prophet, and compounded by the sadness that what had the Ummah done to her right after the passing away of the Prophet of Allah to the Lady of Heaven. And because of these, she was so upset. Her health declined at the prime of her life. She was so upset that she never said salam to these people and never allowed them to attend her janazah, and she was buried at night and no one knows where her grave is. So that's one story. The second story is, yes, she had endured her losses in the past, but when the Prophet died, she started crying and kept crying. There was some altercation that happened with Umar, but she died because of crying, and she was being upset with the death of the Prophet. Yes, Fadak was taken away, but she was crying because of the death of her father. Yes, her husband was taken to the court because he did not give bay'ah, but she was crying for the death of her father. Yes, her grave is unknown because no one attended, but she just kept crying because of the death of her father. So then the question for a regular logical reader is, without having any particular bias against certain personalities, which version logically explains what happened? Now, when you think about logic and you think about history, it is very important to understand it in a very structured way, because a lot of people will discredit history, and that is exactly what we're going to do now. So there are two ways, as I mentioned in the beginning, two ways to understand anything. One is the historical perspective, the second one is logical reasoning. The historical perspective, you can bring up narrations and facts and all those things, but when shaitan is at play, when there is some personal hidden agenda, when someone wants to twist the facts, the easiest answer that I've seen in argument and multitude of arguments with Sunni Muslim brothers is, all of these events are weak, so we cannot believe weak narrations. And that argument can be done against anything, and you can literally ignore anything by taking that argument. Or the other perspective is, you bring in logic and you create this logical argument that shows that this issue is too important to ignore, because we're talking about our hereafter. We're not talking about like some person on the street whose life doesn't matter. We're talking about the leader of the heaven, whose father is the Prophet, who is the source of the shafaat on the day of judgment, whose husband will have the alam, will have the flag of the Prophet according to the narrations of the Prophet, who's looking at her husband is Sawab, who is Haidar Karrar, who is the defender of Islam in Badr, Uhud, Hunain, Azab, Khandak, Khaybar, every place. You're talking about Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. And then whose sons, Imam Hassan and Hussein, are the two leaders of the youth of heaven. So you're not talking about any person on the street whose life might not be as valuable, even though all lives are valuable. But over here we're talking about the leader of the heaven, who's not a common person, whose life is the source of light in this world. So that's why it's even more important to not just think about, not just ignoring the facts, but rather thinking it through logically and build your perspective, because this might be a question that will be asked on the day of judgment. What was your position on this when these facts were laid in front of you? So the situation is, as we have talked about so far, the narrations, both Shia and non-Shia Muslims, that a house next to the Prophet Mosque was burned, and it happened soon after the Prophet's death. The question is, whose house was burned? So there is the weakest narration or the strongest narration. There's only one house that is mentioned to be burned near the mosque of the Prophet. That is the house of Syeda Fatima Zehra SWT and the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam, in which there were 4 children and Imam Ali alayhi salam. Now, as I mentioned, let's ask the question, who is Syeda Fatima Zehra? She is without a doubt, according to all the narrations in all the Shia Sunni Muslim books, leader of the women of heaven, mother of the leader of the youth of heaven, and daughter of the last prophet of Allah, Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, if that is true, then let me ask this other question. Is anyone except the leader of heaven guaranteed heaven? Absolutely not. There is no one who's guaranteed heaven except for the leaders of the heaven, because they own heaven. So then the question is, are companions of the Prophet superior than the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam? If our criteria is Jannah as the final victory, then on one hand you have people who are the leaders of Jannah, they're guaranteed Jannah. On the other hand, you have regular Muslims who might be Sahabi or not, but they're not guaranteed Jannah. They're not the leaders of the heaven. Even if someone says that they have been given Bashara of Jannah, that doesn't mean that their Bashara will sustain after the death of the Prophet if they do good. I mean, even think about this. Shaitan was elevated because he kept on doing good things, but as soon as he did one bad thing, he was thrown from the top to the bottom. So all of your good deeds can take you to the top, but that doesn't mean they will sustain you to the top. But the leaders who have been given Jannah, they are there, they own Jannah. So anyone, any companion, any human, any Muslim, who are not the leaders of the heaven, they are not superior to the leaders of the heaven. So the answer is no. Are companions of the Prophet superior than the Ahl Bayt? The answer is no. Is there a main alleged perpetrator in all accounts? The answer is yes, and we're going to talk about that. Yes, there is only one person who's mentioned in all the accounts. There's no like 10 people whose name is there. There's one person and his slave and others, like everyone revolves around this one person, the second caliph. We're going to talk about this. Who was the alleged perpetrator who burned the house? Were they the non-Muslims, kuffar of Makkah, or like some other Jewish or Christians or others, or a prominent companion? He was a very prominent companion. There is no doubt about that. So if that is the case, let's summarize this. No one is guaranteed heaven except the leaders of the heaven, the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. Hence they are superior to all the companions. Their house, the house of Syeda Fatima Zehra, leader of the women, was burned by a prominent companion who is the only alleged oppressor in all accounts among all sects. So then the deduction from this summary is there are two scenarios. One, if the event took place, it was an epic atrocity, a sinful human burning the house of the leader of heavens. There could be no comparison to the degree of atrocity and punishment that this thing, that the degree of disgrace that this event brings to humanity. And the second is, not sure if this event happened. So the question is, so if the first question, if this event took place, this is the worst thing that could have ever happened. Second is, not sure if the event happened or not. So the basic question becomes, did the event actually happen or not? So many Muslims who call themselves Ahl Sunnah reject the event, asserting that the narrations are weak. Are they weak? The question is, are they weak, or is the confusion intentional to confuse the masses that the event did not take place? So now that we agree that the event, if the event took place, it was a huge atrocity, the difference between Shia and Sunnah becomes clear. Shia believe that this event did take place and Syeda Fatima Zehra was martyred, while Sunnah reject the event, asserting that the narrations are weak. So are they truly weak? Let's continue our logical reasoning to explore the event, the historical circumstances, and documentation of narrations. So when did the event actually take place? The event takes place the two options. Did it take place after 100 years of the Prophet's death or within 1 year of the Prophet's death? It happened right after the death of the Prophet. If it happened, it did not happen later. So that is one fact agreed upon everywhere. Second, when were the Sahih narrations compiled? So this is again a really interesting question. The narrations, all the narrations that are mentioned or called Sahih Sitta, they were compiled. Were they compiled right after the death of the Prophet within 1 year or after 100 years, 100 plus years? The answer is after 100 plus years, because there was prohibition on writing any hadith or compiling any narration during this 100 plus years. During Banu Umayyah, during the Caliphs, they were not allowed to compile anything. So question number 3, who was in power at the time of compilation? Were Ahl Bayt in power? Were non-Ahl Bayt, the Caliphs who were against Ahl Bayt in power? It were non-Ahl Bayt Caliphs who were in power. Banu Umayyah was specifically at that time. So then the question is, if Caliphs were in power and Ahl Bayt were not in power, did Caliphs support Ahl Bayt al-Islam or they confiscated their rights? If one says they supported Ahl Bayt al-Islam, then what would we say to all the events, for example, usurpation of Fadak, taking away the right of Imam Ali alayhi salam, Muawiyah standing up against Imam Ali alayhi salam, Muawiyah is standing up against Imam Hassan alayhi salam, part of Ahl Bayt, Yazid killing and martyring Imam Hussain alayhi salam in Karbala, again Imam Hussain being part of Ahl Bayt, Yazid being the Caliph of Banu Umayyah, and so on and so forth. After that, all the generations of Banu Umayyah and Banu Abbas, they were all caliphs. The Ahl Bayt alayhi salam, from Imam Ali alayhi salam all the way through the 11th Imam, they were always persecuted. The caliphs did not support Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. They always confiscated their rights. And then at that time, was there free media or news channels or internet? The simple answer is no, there wasn't any. So the question is, who wrote the history and historical events? Were regular independent people who were writing on internet and making videos documenting these events, or were they documented by paid historians? Obviously paid historians. There was nothing like free media or democracy at that time. There was no internet, if you don't know. So it was paid historians who wrote down these events. And who paid the historians? Obviously the government, who was controlled by the caliphs, not the Ahl Bayt al-Islam, because Ahl Bayt al-Islam were persecuted all the time. So does the payroll and authority result in influence? Absolutely yes. We see that today in this modern world. Whoever pays your ads, or whoever gives you contribution in your fundraising or your political campaigns, they influence your end goals. Let alone what was happening 1400 years when there was only one power, oppression, paid historians. They were influencing the history. So then the final question is there a possibility of historical accounts being changed as history was officially documented? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. The logical deduction from all of these is that narrations were captured more than 100 years after the attack on the house of Syeda Fatima Zehra SWT and Ahl Bayt alayhi salam by the state-sponsored historians, while the Caliph was against the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. Hence, there is a probability and a likely possibility of manipulation of historical events. So the deduction over here is, while there is a possibility of manipulation of narrations, rendering them as weak, it is highly unlikely that the narration manipulation was in the favor of Ahl Bayt al-Islam or against the caliphs. Because if they were manipulated in favor of Ahl Bayt al-Islam or against the caliph, it just doesn't make sense, because they were being sponsored by the caliphs. and that we see today in our life here. Whoever sponsors gets to have their narrative communicated, whether in any country. And that's how the TV channels are brought. And this is free media. So it is unlikely, while there is a possibility of manipulation of narrations, rendering them as weak, because the weakness is one of the main arguments of broader Muslims, it is highly unlikely that the narrations manipulation was in favor of Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. So the question is, what was then the goal of the manipulation? Was it to insert the event and make caliphs look bad, or to hide the event? And secondly, what type of narrations might be considered as weak? So then this goes to this question number, this question again, the series of questions that we need to consider, so that are these weak narrations, are these narrations really weak, or whether confusion was intentionally introduced. So the situation is, narrations were documented, just to recap, narrations were documented by state-sponsored historians who worked for the caliphs, and caliphs never had good relationships with the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. In fact, they kept on killing the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. Therefore, it is unlikely that weak narrations were added and documented to support Ahl Bayt alayhi salam or weaken the prominent caliphs. So, what type of fabrication was pursued and what narrative was created? Because if Ahl Bayt alayhi salam were in parallel to the caliphs who were persecuting Ahl Bayt alayhi salam, why would they want to add narrations which make the caliphs and their reign or access to power weak in front of the masses? Because then all the narrations will point towards the rightful ownership of this power is Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. So in fact, then let's consider what type of manipulation actually happened. And the interesting thing is, confusion was used as a tool to obfuscate the facts. So let's think about this. Since caliphs did not support the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam, what would be the potential motivation of changing or manipulating these historical events? To support Ahl Bayt alayhi salam, or to confuse the masses that caliphs did not do anything wrong against the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam? Absolutely, it would be the second one, because they wanted to keep their own house in order, so they wanted to confuse the masses that caliphs had the best relationships with Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. And then why weren't rulers, compilers, able to remove the reference of this event or of the second caliph from these narrations? That's an important question. As these were documented, why weren't these references totally removed? And one reason could be they wanted to highlight the shortcomings of the second caliph and what happened to Syeda Fatima Zehra. Or the event was so prevalent, it was so obvious, it happened with such glaring brutality in the middle of Medina, right after the death of the Prophet, that they couldn't hide the event. So they had to resort to something else. Since these narrations and references couldn't be removed, then how do you protect the perpetrators? Because these perpetrators laid the foundation of the abuse on Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. How do you protect them if you cannot remove these narrations? You can do that by leaving everything as is, but that won't result in anything. That won't help the perpetrators. Then you create confusion. You create confusion by what? Keeping quiet? No, you create confusion by claiming that the narrations are weak, by adding narrations to confuse that the affairs between Ahl Bayt alayhi salam and caliphs were all fine, by elevating the status of the caliphs with fabricated narrations, so that you create confusion, intentional confusion. And then when you create the confusion, the next question is, there will be questions. How do you avoid these questions? Do you avoid these questions by freedom of opinion? Absolutely not. You cannot avoid these questions with freedom of opinion. Then what do? You forcefully enforce rule of no discussion. You claim that Shia are kafir, so people should not listen to them. And you argue that even if you listen to them, you hear their majalis, you go to their majalis, you listen to them, even your marriages will be nullified so that you don't hear what actually happened. And that these were all the tools to create confusion. So in summary, since the government machinery couldn't eliminate this event from the history books because of its persistence and eyewitness accounts, confusion was created through a new narrative claiming that the narrations related to the events are fake, while new fabrications were added to elevate the status of certain caliphs and normalize their affairs with the Ahl Bayt al-Islam, simultaneously curbing freedom of free speech and inhibiting people from hearing the other version was utilized to make sure that there are no questions that were asked. So the deduction over here is, there was fabrication for sure, but it was intentional to create confusion, misguide the Ummah, and protect the actions of the second caliph. So now then the question is, now, what does the logical mind tell you to do? Side with the leaders of heaven or the perpetrators? Now, up to this point, what we have gathered is there were things that happened that there was intentional confusion that was created to hide the facts which were documented after 100 years. But the facts couldn't be removed from the history books at the beginning because they were so widespread, so apparent. So they had to create new ways to create narrations, parallel narratives, so that the actual reality is hidden of what happened to the house of Syeda Fatima Zehra and Ahl Bayt al-Islam. Now this is everything that we know of, right? Now let's think about who benefited the most from this event. It's important to understand this because even in today's life, we try to understand who's the main beneficiary. And that's why it's important to understand the role of the main accused, the perpetrator, the second caliph, before, during, and after the incident, while we're trying to understand his role. And this will either support, corroborate our logic, or negate it. If he is nowhere to be found, then he will have a blank check. But if there is something special about this fellow of ours, then we will need to really examine it closely. So even in this society that we live in 2020, like what's the year? I don't even remember the year. 2022. We live in 2022. What does the legal system say? It says, identify the main beneficiary of the event. And second, look for a character who stands out more than others during, before, and after the event. So let's look about that. Let's think about that. Events before the incident itself. The incident itself, and then events after the incident. Then see like if there's someone who's standing out. So there is narration that there was an army that the Prophet had asked everyone to go. After the final Hajj, the Prophet ordered several senior Sahaba companions to go with the army of Usama. But there were a few people who said no. Among them was Umar and Abu Bakr. Second is the hadith of Kirtas. This is very important because we need to ask, and everyone knows about it, it's in like all Shia Sunni books, that who said no to the Prophet when he asked for something to write so that the Ummah isn't confused, isn't misguided. It was explicitly, without any doubt, Umar. And then number 3, Saqifa. This is where the Caliph was selected, Abu Bakr was selected. But who was the first person to proclaim Abu Bakr as the caliph at Saqifa, even when the Prophet's body wasn't even buried? It was Umar. So then question number 4 is, what was the average age of this time? This is important because age will play an important role. Average age was roughly 60 years. Abu Bakr at the time was roughly 59 to 60 years. Umar was around 40 years. He had roughly 10 to 12 years of his life left. Imam Ali al-Islam was roughly 33 years. So if Imam Ali had become caliph, chances of Umar becoming caliph were next to none, because Imam Ali al-Islam had like roughly 30 years of life left. Whereas if Abu Bakr became caliph, Umar, he only had like 1 or 2 years of life left. So Umar would have easily become the caliph after Abu Bakr. And then think about this. Who had the history of hitting women in the past? It was Umar. Everyone knows about it. He went, it is a famous narration that he accepted Islam because he went to hit his sister who was reciting Quran. So he had that thing in himself to hit the women. It wasn't like beyond him to hit women. So before events suggest Umar did not go with the army of Usama with the Prophet instructed. Umar did not give the pen and paper for the Prophet to write. Umar was the one who selected or gave bay'ah to Abu Bakr the first time. And Umar, from an age perspective, was, if Imam Ali had become, Umar would not have any chance of becoming a caliph, but with Abu Bakr he had a chance to become a caliph. And Umar had the history of hitting women. So now let's come to the event itself. When it comes to the bay'ah of Ali alayhi salam, who was hell-bent on getting the bay'ah from Ali alayhi salam right away? It was Umar. Who is mentioned that they had the altercation with Syeda Fatima Zehra at her door to take out Imam Ali alayhi salam? It was Umar. Who is the one person who is accused of burning the door and slamming the door on Syeda Fatima Zehra? It's Umar. Why? And then the question that I want to ask anyone who has logic, who thinks, why is only Umar mentioned in all the Shia and Sunnah narrations as the person involved in this incident? There were thousands of other Sahaba in Medina, but only one person? Why? And then, even after hundreds of years of history being written by government-sponsored historians, how come Umar's name comes up in both Shia and Sunnah traditions? Why weren't these narrations removed from the Sunnah text? And that again is the point that I mentioned previously, that these narrations and events were so persistent that people couldn't take out the name Umar from the early days. And who is the person who argued against giving fadak to Syeda Fatima Zehra along with Abu Bakr? It was Umar. So just to recap, bay'ah of Imam Ali al-Islam, hell-bent, Umar. Altercation of Syeda Fatima Zehra, Umar. Who is the one person named in burning then slamming the door? Umar. And then who wanted to take off fadak and proposed that and then like pushed for that? It was Umar. So now you see before Umar, during Umar. And after the event, let's think about the beneficiary. Like Umar was doing all of these things. Was he getting any benefit? And who Syeda Fatima Zehra was angry with? So anger of Syeda Fatima Zehra, he was angry specifically with Abu Bakr and Umar. The funeral of Syeda Fatima Zehra, explicitly there were some people who were not allowed, and most Muslims were included, specifically Umar and Abu Bakr. And who was the beneficiary of this entire event? Who became the caliph after Abu Bakr? It was Umar. And why did Umar follow the way of Abu Bakr? And this is a question that we should think about. Why didn't Umar follow the way of Abu Bakr as he became the caliph and led the affairs to a shura? Because the way Abu Bakr became caliph was against the Sunnah, and it was a power game by Umar, because Umar nominated a shura for people to select their caliph, while Abu Bakr nominated Umar directly. Was he rewarding him for something, or Umar planned this? So in summary, the second caliph was very active during this chain of events with a goal of rulership. He first supported Abu Bakr and clashed with Syeda Fatima on the issue of Abu Bakr's bay'ah by Imam Ali alayhi salam, and then became the main beneficiary of the events by becoming the caliph after Abu Bakr. So when one combines all of these things, logical deductions and insights, a transformative narrative appears. We talked about the facts. For the Lady Fatima Zehra SWT, Prophet had said, "Whoever angers her angers me. She is the lady of the women of the heaven." She died just a few months after the death of the Prophet, at a tender age of 19. There was an altercation between Umar and Syeda Fatima Zehra at her door. She expressed displeasure with the caliph and did not talk to him, and specifically instructed Umar and Abu Bakr to not attend her janazah. The questions over here were, why did Syeda Fatima die so quickly? Who was present at the janazah and who buried her? Then the house of the leaders of heaven. No one is guaranteed heaven except the leaders of heaven, the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. Hence they are superior to all companions. Their house, the house of Syeda Fatima Zehra, was burnt by a prominent companion who is the only alleged perpetrator, oppressor in all accounts, among all sects. So there are two possible scenarios over here. If the event took place, it was an epic atrocity that can never be measured, can be justified. Or two, we are not sure if the event took place or not, because the narrations are weak. So based on these two questions, the question is, are these narrations truly weak? So let's think about this. Narrations were captured more than 100 years after the attack on the house of Syeda Fatima Zehra by the state-sponsored historians, while the caliphate was against the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. Hence there is probability of manipulation of historical accounts. While there is a probability of manipulation, rendering them as weak, it is highly unlikely that the narrations manipulation was in the favor of Ahl Bayt alayhi salam. Then what was the purpose of this manipulation? So the purpose of this manipulation was to create confusion and change the narrative. Since the government machinery couldn't eliminate this event from the history books because of its presence and witness accounts, confusion was intentionally introduced through a new narrative, claiming that the narrations related to the events are weak, are fake, while fabricating new narrations to elevate the status of certain caliphs and normalize their affairs with Ahl Bayt alayhi salam, simultaneously curbing freedom of speech and inhibiting people from hearing the other side. So the conclusion is, there was fabrication for sure, but the key question is there an alternate way to corroborate the logic? But the confusion was to increase the status of certain caliphs. Now the key question for us is, we know that there is confusion that was created. We know that narrations were weakened. We know that things were happening which should not be happening. So is there in parallel a track that we can take to identify what happened? And that is where we need to understand what was the role of the second caliph, who was very active during the chain of events with the goal of rulership. He first supported Abu Bakr, clashed with Syeda Fatima Zehra and on the issue of Abu Bakr's bay'ah by Imam Ali alayhi salam, and became the main beneficiary of this entire event. The role of the second caliph is very suspicious and self-fulfilling. It is possible that a person with previous anger issues who had a history of hitting women, in the thirst of power, committed crimes that are mentioned in historical accounts. It is possible. So what? I'm not saying that it happened. I'm not saying that I have a certain belief. I'm not imposing that belief. I'm saying it is very possible that this could have happened. So what? Based on all the evidence and the logical deductions, there is a very high probability that this event took place and Syeda Fatima Zehra was injured, who later succumbed to her injuries as a martyr. Furthermore, an intentional narrative was created over centuries to hide this reality, which involved exalting the status of key companions. So, what should we do? Our responsibility as an inquisitive human, if there's a chance that this incident happened, if there is an iota of a chance, and Syeda Fatima was injured, who later embraced martyrdom because of the injuries, based on all the evidence and logical deduction, what should we do? That is the question. The key questions that any individual human should ask. Is the daughter of the Prophet the leader of the women of heaven? If yes, who is superior in front of Allah? The leader of the women, leader of the heaven, or the companions? Obviously the leader of the heavens. What are the chances of entering the paradise by angering the owners? Like literally none. Like if you want to enter a home and you angered the owners of the home, will they ever allow you to enter and live with you in the home? No, absolutely not. So is anyone amongst us guaranteed to accept heaven other than the leaders of the heaven? No. If we don't know whether we will enter the heaven or not, shouldn't we try to increase our chances? Absolutely yes. I mean, that should be our goal. We do that by salat, by som, by zakat, by hajj, by all of these good deeds. So, but can one improve our chances by aligning with the leaders of heaven? Yes. I mean, there is nothing which says no. If you align yourself with the leaders of heaven, why would your chances not go up? Absolutely, they will go up. Can one say that they align with the leaders of the heaven, but they also defend the potential oppressors who has a high probability of causing this pain? No. I mean, how is that even possible? So since every Muslim wants to enter the heaven, but no one knows if they will or not, logic suggests that we should align ourselves with leaders of Jannah to increase our chances of entering heaven. However, one cannot say that they support the leaders but also defend the oppressors who kill the leaders. So the deduction is one needs to make a choice. They defend the perpetrators. 2, they keep quiet and stay neutral. Or 3, they support the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. So the question is, how do these choices play out in a scenario planning exercise? Because we don't really know what the right choice is. We know that there's a potential that this event took place. As a Muslim, I have a different belief. I know that this happened. But as a regular Muslim, yes, no one knows, like we weren't there. Even if we would have seen by our own eyes, Allah Ta'ala says in Quran, even if the angels come in front of you, they will, who are not willing to believe, they will say our eyes have been, it's magic on our eyes. We don't believe what we see. So even if I post everything like a video evidence that this is how it is happening, people who are not going to believe, they will come up with 1,001 reasons. But my goal isn't to prove. My goal is to create enough doubt so that you can do your own research and create your own logical reasoning. So what does that mean in a scenario planning exercise, especially if you don't know? Let's think about what are the alternatives. So the scenario planning exercise is very interesting. On the day of judgment, this is just a scenario. On the day of judgment, if we face the Lady of Heaven, which we will, obviously, if we want to enter heaven, Jannah, we will face the Lady of Heaven. We will face her sons. We will face her father. That's a fact. If you face the Lady of Heaven along with his father, husband, and sons at the door of paradise, and she asks, what did you do when you heard about the oppression that happened to her? What will we say? Are we going to, we have 3 options. We can say, we defended your enemies and celebrated them as heroes. Abu Bakr, Umar, the greatest heroes of the entire world. That is what we did in our life. The second option is we kept quiet as we weren't sure if this happened or not. So we decided to keep quiet. Or number 3, we condemned the oppressors, never forgot what happened, and cried on your difficulties and highlighted your pain wherever it was possible. So these are 3 different answers from 3 different groups. And whoever listens to this podcast today, 50 years from now, 100 years, who knows when, next month, I can tell you, if they are Sunnis, they will be 90% in group 1. Because they have elevated Umar and Abu Bakr to a level which is beyond anything. And then there is a small group who will be number 2. And if they're Shias, they will be number 3 with a small group in number 2. But let's think about how would these 3 scenarios play out with the options of the incident. Let's say, so this matrix over here shows that you have 3 answers on the left and the 2 potential scenarios on the top. Scenario 1 is the house of Syeda Fatima Zehra was burnt and she was martyred due to injuries. The second option is the event is fabricated and never happened. So if the house was burned and she died, and you come across Syeda Fatima Zehra and you say you defended the killers and you argued that the narration is fake, then the question that she might ask is, when you heard, why didn't you explore? This might result in displeasure of Ahlul Bayt alayhis salam, as you supported the killers, and it raises questions on your iman, because if you're supporting the killers, that in itself is wrong. But you're not only supporting the killers, you're supporting their entire practice and everything that they've done in the religion. Whatever they've instituted, you've been supporting that. You've been doing the same thing. You've been doing the practices instituted by the killer. So how can you claim to enter Jannah when you're following the practices instituted by a killer who himself doesn't know what is right or wrong? Because he just had killed someone. Not someone, the leader of the heaven. The second is, if you keep quiet and neutral, then the question is, then the leaders of heaven might ask, didn't you have intellect and mind to use reasoning to understand whether the event actually took place or not? Why were you giving them benefit of the doubt? But you might get benefit of the doubt. Okay, if that is the case, who knows? It's up to Allah. And then the third one, the group of people who condemned the killers, they will be happy and they will get the support of the leaders of the heaven as true followers. So that is the scenario you want to be in at the bottom if this happened. And if this event is fabricated and you're defending and you defended the perpetrators, then no harm. You'll be okay because the event never happened and you defended the companions. That's good. And if you keep quiet and it didn't happen, that's also good. I mean, you will not be impacted. And then the third one, if you condemn those killers and the event didn't happen, then there might be a question why you propagated when you didn't have confirmation. The simple answer would be, it could be compensated by the fact that we had doubt, so we supported the Ahlul Bayt alayhis salam in this doubt, because their love is made compulsory in Quran. And the doubt wasn't just 50-50, the doubt was 75%. So we made our ijtihad to support the Ahlul Bayt alayhis salam. It is the same logic as the Sunnis say when they elevate Muawiyah and they say that Muawiyah did ijtihad, Imam Ali did ijtihad, so both of them will get their good deeds for doing ijtihad. Muawiyah was wrong, but still he will get a good deed. On the other hand, Yazid did ijtihad, Imam Hussain did ijtihad. That's like the logic that they use. For us, that is like the worst kind of ijtihad logic you can bring. For us, it's based on logic. I've just showed you 1 hour of logical deduction why Umar was the person who benefited, why all of these narrations were introduced to fabricate not this event, but to confuse people against this event, and why there's something that happened and we need to know. So there is a really high probability that this event took place and Umar was involved. And if you're doing ijtihad based on that and you're supporting Ahl Bayt al-Islam, that is the right thing to do. So the conclusion is even if there is less than 1% probability that this event happened, a logical Muslim should prefer abstaining from the first group. First group is no way. You should never be in the first group, because even if there is a 1% probability, you're standing up against the leaders of the heaven who own the heaven, and you don't want to be in that situation. If one believes that there's more than 50% probability that this happened, which is evident from the logical deductions, one should be in the third group. That's kind of like very systemized way of thinking about this. You should never be in first group. Either you should be in second or third. Third group, if you believe it happened, there is a probability of more than 50%. So in conclusion, I want to recommend how to deal with this event. Today is likely the last Siyam of the year 2022, and I don't know if it is Iftar. I know it is Iftar. I don't know if it is the time has come or the moon has been sighted or not. In any case, I would like to just lay this out over here and recommend all of us to think and ponder and have our faith so strong that it is never shaken by the shaitan that is all around us. So in order to deal with this event, as I mentioned, there are 3 options. 1, if in your doubt, you think there is less than 1% probability, more than 0, less than 1% probability that this event happened, a logical Muslim should prefer abstaining from the first group. You should not be defending the potential perpetrators who was involved in the killing, martyrdom of Syeda Fatima Zehra, who's the leader of the heaven. You should not be. And honestly, no matter what one says, no one will ever have 100% certainty that this event happened and it didn't happen. Because as I mentioned, even if I bring in video evidence, people will say, I don't believe this. This is doctored. Second, if one believes that there is a probability more than 50%, and based on all of this evidence, as I mentioned, it is more than 50%. In my book, it is 100%. In other books, it might be 90%. If it is more than 50%, you should be in the third group, so that you, in front of the leaders of the heaven on the day of judgment, the leader of the Shafa, the Prophet himself, you stand up with your head up front. And then the third group is anyone who thinks there is a 1 to 50% probability, or there is some like up to 50% probability that this happened, more than 1%, they should be in the second group. They should be quiet. They should not be supporting the potential perpetrators. And then there are other implications that I want to highlight, that narrations were indeed fabricated. What Sunni brothers say, that is indeed true, and a parallel narrative was built, but it was built to confuse the masses so that the value and the majesty of the Ahl Bayt al-Islam can be reduced and the atrocities that happen to them can be hidden. So just to highlight this entire topic opens up an entire new dimension of discussions about all of those narrations which are elevating certain Sahaba, certain companions, which are highlighting events and narrations that happened during the life of the Prophet or after that, which might not be true. So this opens a very different dimension of discussions. And the last thing, don't trust the narrations that elevate key caliphs or try to normalize the relationship between the caliphs and the Ahl Bayt al-Islam, because there is a chance that they are fabricated. In the end, may Allah guide us towards the right path. May this year that is coming, that is starting after Ramadan with Eid, bring us closer to Ahl Bayt al-Islam and show us the true path of what we should be doing. The path followed by those who have been blessed and not those who were condemned. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'een. Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. Sirat al-lazina anamta alayhim. Ghayril maghdubi alayhim walad-dallin.